Are you sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin. There is a place at the far edge of the world where the horizon stretches so far it stops feeling real. A place of ice, silence, and distance without end. In 1947, a fleet was sent there. Not a small expedition, but a full military operation. Officially, it was routine. But the scale suggested something else. Because this was not a journey into the known, it was a movement toward the edge. Chapter 1. The Edge of the World. If you've never seen Antarctica in person, it's hard to explain it properly. Not because it's complicated, but because it's almost too simple. White, flat, endless. Imagine standing in a place where the horizon doesn't feel like a line, it feels like a suggestion. Where the sky and the ground start to blur into each other, like someone forgot to draw the border properly. There's no city noise, no distant traffic. Not even birds most of the time, just wind, and even that comes and goes like it's not fully committed to the job. It's quiet in a way that feels deliberate, like the world stepped back and said, you figure this part out. And the strangest part, it doesn't feel like you're at the bottom of the earth. It feels like you've stepped slightly off it. Now, I know that sounds dramatic, and yeah, maybe I've just had one too many coffees. But explorers who've actually been there describe something similar. Not fear exactly, just a sense that you're somewhere that doesn't quite behave like the rest of the planet. Distances become hard to judge. Time feels slower. The landscape repeats itself so perfectly that your brain starts looking for something, anything, to anchor to. And it doesn't find much. Which raises a quiet question, not a loud one, just something that sits in the background. If a place feels this disconnected, how well do we really know it? Because before you can understand what happened there, you have to understand where there actually is. And in 1947, something arrived at that edge. Chapter 2. A Fleet in the South. They didn't rush in, that's important. Operation Highjump didn't feel like a dramatic charge into the unknown. It was slower than that, more deliberate. Like a convoy that already knew the journey mattered, even if the destination wasn't fully clear. Ships moved first, cutting through dark water that gradually filled with ice. Not solid at first, just fragments, floating pieces, then larger sheets, then fields of it, stretching out like broken glass frozen mid-shatter. You can almost picture it. A naval vessel pushing forward, steel against ice. The sound echoing across miles of nothing. No audience, no landmarks, just movement. Behind and around them, more ships. Support vessels, aircraft carriers, destroyers. A formation that didn't feel exploratory, it felt prepared. Above them, aircraft sat waiting. Wings folded, engines quiet, like they were holding their breath. Nearly 4,700 personnel in total. Not scientists scribbling notes in the snow. This was structured, organized, military. And yet, there was no urgency, no battle, no visible threat, just presence. Which is where it gets a little strange. Because when you send that many resources to a place like Antarctica, you're usually expecting something, even if you don't say it out loud, or maybe especially if you don't say it out loud. Now, imagine being one of the crew. Days pass, then weeks, ice in every direction, same sky, same cold, same quiet. You'd start to wonder, what exactly are we here for? And I'd like to think someone probably did ask that question. Maybe not in an official meeting, more like leaning against a railing, staring out into nothing, saying, so, we testing equipment or we about to discover something weird? And someone else just shrugs, probably both. Because the deeper they moved into the south, the less it felt like a routine mission, and the more it felt like something else entirely, something that hadn't quite revealed itself yet. Chapter 3. After the War. By the time Operation Highjump begins, the world is trying to breathe again. The war is over. Cities are rebuilding. Factories are slowing down. People are going back to ordinary things, work, family, quiet routines. Picture it. Someone fixing a fence, someone making coffee, someone saying, well, that's done now. And for the most part, it was. But not everywhere. Because while the rest of the world is stepping out of conflict, a fleet is quietly being assembled. Ships refitted, aircraft prepared, supplies stacked and counted, thousands of men reassigned, not to a battlefield, but to the far south. And here's the strange part. There's no urgency in the way it's described. No crisis, no immediate threat, just movement. Calm, planned, deliberate. Almost like someone had already decided this needed to happen before the war had even ended. Now, to be fair, the official reasoning holds up on the surface. Cold weather training, equipment testing, strategic preparation. Makes sense, right? You win a global war, you learn from it. But even so, the contrast is hard to ignore. Because while most of the world is putting things down, this operation is gearing up. And not quietly either. This is scale, real scale. The kind that doesn't usually get approved unless it matters. So, you end up with this strange overlap. Peace on one side of the world, preparation on the other. And somewhere in between, a question that doesn't quite go away. Why now? Why, at the moment everything else is winding down, does something this large begin? You don't need an answer yet, just hold on to that feeling. Because the further south they go, the less that contrast starts to feel like coincidence, and the more it starts to feel like intent. And intent tends to leave traces. Chapter 4. The Shape of Antarctica. If you look at Antarctica on a map, it seems simple. A white mass at the bottom of the world. Clean edges, defined shape, clearly understood. But maps are confident things. Reality is a bit quieter. Because Antarctica isn't just a surface, it's layers. Miles of ice sitting on top of land that most of us have never really seen. Mountains buried, valleys hidden, entire landscapes sealed beneath pressure and time. It's not just a continent, it's a cover. And even today, large parts of it remain difficult to reach, let alone study in detail. Now, that's not unusual for a place like this. The environment alone makes exploration complicated. Extreme cold, sudden storms, distances that don't behave the way you expect. You don't just pop over to the interior for a look around. Even now, access is selective. So, when we talk about Antarctica being known, what we really mean is partially understood. We know the outline, we don't always know the depth. And that distinction matters more than it seems, because it leaves room, not for wild conclusions, just for uncertainty. The kind of uncertainty that sits quietly in the background, not obvious, not dramatic, but present. And once you start thinking about it that way, the map begins to feel less like a complete picture and more like a summary, a simplified version of something far more complex. Now, imagine approaching that place, not from a satellite image, but from sea level. Ice rising ahead of you, horizon blending into the sky. No landmarks, no reference points, just white meeting white. And somewhere beyond that, terrain you cannot fully see. Terrain you cannot fully confirm. And maybe that's the key detail. Not that Antarctica is unknown, but that it has never been fully resolved. And if that's true, then every expedition that enters it isn't just exploring a place, it's stepping into something that still holds gaps. And gaps have a habit of becoming something else, once people start trying to fill them in. Chapter 5. Admiral Byrd. At the centre of all of this, there's a man who doesn't seem like a mystery at all. Admiral Richard E. Byrd. If you've ever heard the name before, it's probably in a very grounded context. Exploration, aviation, polar expeditions. The kind of achievements that get written down, catalogued, understood. And that's important, because Byrd isn't an outsider figure. He's establishment. Decorated naval officer, experienced pilot, someone trusted to lead missions that require precision, discipline, and calm decision-making. He's not the kind of person you associate with exaggeration. If anything, he comes across as measured, deliberate. The kind of person who says exactly what needs to be said and nothing more. And maybe that's why his presence here matters, because when someone like that is placed in command of something this large, you assume clarity, you assume purpose. You assume that whatever is happening is being handled by someone who understands it. But here's where it gets interesting, because Byrd, in his public tone, doesn't speak like someone who sees Antarctica as fully understood. He talks about scale, distance, difficulty, and occasionally something else. Not loudly, not dramatically, just small shifts in language. References to areas that are still unknown. spaces that haven't been fully explored. Nothing extraordinary on its own, but when you place those remarks next to everything else, the size of the mission, the timing, the location, they start to carry a different weight. Not as proof of anything, just as alignment, like pieces that sit next to each other a little too neatly. Now, to be clear, Byrd never stands up and declares anything unusual. There's no moment where the story suddenly flips. It's quieter than that. And maybe that's what makes it stick. Because instead of giving you a clear answer, it leaves you with something else, a tone, a sense that even the person leading this expedition understood that what they were moving into was not entirely mapped. And if that's true, then the question shifts slightly. Not what he found, not yet, but what he expected to find before they ever arrived. Chapter 6. A continent not fully known. There's a quiet assumption most of us carry, that by now the world has been mapped. Not perfectly maybe, but enough to feel complete. And for most places that's true. But Antarctica doesn't quite follow that rule. Not because no one has tried. People have crossed it, studied it, measured it from above and below. But the environment has a way of setting limits. Cold that shuts machines down. Wind that erases tracks in minutes. Distances that don't feel like distance, just endless repetition. You don't explore Antarctica the way you explore anywhere else. You negotiate with it, and sometimes it says no. There are regions that are technically reachable, but rarely visited. Not because they're forbidden, just because getting there and getting back isn't always guaranteed. So, over time, something subtle happens. The map fills in, but not evenly. Some areas become well understood, others remain quieter, less detailed. Not mysterious in a dramatic sense, just incomplete. And that word matters more than it sounds, because incomplete doesn't mean unknown. It means partially seen, partially described. Like a conversation where half the sentences were lost in the wind. And if you're leading an expedition into a place like that, you're not just moving through geography, you're moving through gaps. And here's something to sit with just for a second. If a place is only partially understood, how would you know where that line actually is? Where known ends and something else begins? That's not a dramatic question, it's a practical one. The kind of question that would matter a lot if you were planning a flight across it, which, as it turns out, is exactly what comes next. Chapter 7. Regions without detail. If you go back through early records of Antarctic exploration, you'll notice something odd. Not in what's written, but in what isn't. There are stretches where descriptions become thinner. Not absent, just less precise. An entry might say something like, terrain continues, conditions unchanged. And that's it. No landmarks, no distinguishing features, just continuation. Now that could mean exactly what it sounds like. Miles and miles of the same landscape. Ice, snow, horizon, repeat. And to be fair, that's often the case. But over time, these kinds of descriptions begin to stack up. Large areas summarized in very small amounts of detail. Not wrong, not misleading, just minimal. And when you read enough of them, a pattern starts to form. Not a conspiracy, nothing like that. Just a quiet absence of resolution. Like someone walking through a place but didn't fully capture it. Or maybe couldn't. Because imagine trying to describe something that doesn't give you anything to describe. No contrast, no variation. Just white on white, for as far as you can see. At some point, the words just run out. And all you're left with is, it continues. But here's the thing. When information thins out like that, it creates space. Not for answers, for interpretation. And once that space exists, people tend to fill it. Sometimes carefully, sometimes not so much. But either way, the gap becomes part of the story. And the further you move into those regions, the more that lack of detail starts to feel like something else. Not hidden, just unresolved. And unresolved places have a way of drawing attention, especially when someone decides to fly directly over them. Chapter 8. The limits of maps. Maps feel final. You look at one and there's a quiet confidence to it. Lines are clean, borders are defined, everything sits exactly where it should. But maps are interpretations. They're the result of someone saying, this is close enough to represent what's there. And for most of the world, that works. But historically, there have always been edges, places where the map doesn't quite know what to do. Old charts would mark them in different ways. Blank space, faded detail, sometimes just a note that says unexplored. Antarctica held on to that status longer than most, not because it was impossible to reach, but because it resisted being fully described. Even as technology improved, even as aircraft made surveying easier, the same issue remained: scale. Not just physical scale, but visual scale. From above, Antarctica can look almost uniform, vast stretches that don't offer clear distinctions. Which means mapping it isn't just about seeing it, it's about interpreting it correctly. And interpretation is never perfect. So, what you end up with is something interesting. A place that exists clearly on the map, but still carries traces of uncertainty underneath it. Not enough to make the map wrong, just enough to remind you it isn't the full story. And when you combine that with everything else, the incomplete regions, the thinning descriptions, you start to get a different picture. Not of a place that's unknown, but of a place that has edges within the map itself. Edges that aren't always visible until you try to cross them. And that's exactly what happens next, because at some point, someone leaves the ground and heads straight into that blankness. Chapter 9. The Long Flight South. Imagine sitting in an aircraft looking out over Antarctica. At first it feels familiar. Ice fields, light reflecting off the surface, shadows stretching across uneven terrain. There's texture, variation, something to hold on to. But then, slowly, that begins to fade. The ground flattens, the contrast softens, landmarks disappear. And before you really notice it, you're looking at something that barely changes at all. Just white. Not bright white, not detailed white, just a kind of endless surface that doesn't give you much back. And the longer you look at it, the harder it becomes to judge distance, or scale, or even movement. You know you're flying, the instruments confirm it, but visually it can feel like you're not going anywhere. Like the world below has stopped, and you're just suspended above it. Now imagine hours of that. No cities, no mountains breaking the line, no coastline to reorient yourself, just repetition, silence, and the steady hum of the aircraft, reminding you that something is happening, even if it doesn't feel like it is. This is where things start to shift, not physically but mentally, because humans rely on reference points. We need contrast to understand space. And when that disappears, the mind starts to fill in the gaps. Nothing dramatic, just small adjustments. A sense that the environment is different. Not dangerous, just hard to define. And somewhere in that experience, a question begins to form. Not about what you're seeing, but about what you might not be seeing. Because if everything looks the same, how would you know if something changed? And that thought, quiet as it is enough to stay with you long after the flight ends. Chapter 10. What was said? When you go looking for clear statements about Antarctica, you don't usually find them. Not bold ones, anyway. What you find instead are remarks, small pieces, observations, things said in passing without much emphasis. And that's where Admiral Byrd becomes interesting again. Because in some of his interviews and reported comments, there are moments where the tone shifts just slightly. Nothing dramatic, no grand declarations, just references. He speaks about vast areas still unexplored, regions that extend beyond what had fully been surveyed. At one point, he mentions the possibility of land beyond the known polar regions, areas described as expansive, larger than expected. And here's the thing, he doesn't linger on it. It's not presented like a revelation. It's said the way you might mention the weather. Calm, matter of fact. Almost like it wasn't the part he thought people would focus on. Now, you could take that at face value, a reflection of how little was known at the time, a simple acknowledgement of scale. And that would be completely reasonable. But when you place those remarks next to everything else, the incomplete maps, the thinning descriptions, the nature of the expedition, they start to feel connected. Not as evidence, just as alignment, like a quiet thread running through the background. And here's where I'll say something to you directly. If someone experienced, measured, and careful mentions that a place isn't fully understood, you don't immediately jump to conclusions, but you don't ignore it either. You just remember it. And maybe that's the key, because those remarks don't answer anything. They don't confirm anything. They just leave a door slightly open. And once that door exists, the next question becomes unavoidable. Not what was said publicly, but what might have been recorded privately. Chapter 11. The Unofficial Record. At some point, the story picks up something it didn't originally have, a document. Not official, not verified, but persistent. Often referred to as Admiral Byrd's private diary. Now, before we go any further, let's be clear. There is no confirmed authentication for this document. No institution has validated it as genuine. So, it sits in a very specific place. Not evidence, not fact, but part of the story. And sometimes that's enough for something to stick around. Because according to the version that circulates, the tone shifts again, from measured observation to something more personal. The diary describes a flight, not unusual on its own. But what follows is where it becomes different. A movement across the polar region, and then a transition. The environment begins to change, subtly at first, then more noticeably. Descriptions that don't quite match the Antarctica we've been talking about. Warmer conditions, terrain that feels unfamiliar, and moments that read less like a report and more like a memory being written down after the fact. Now again, this is not confirmed. It could be misattributed, it could be entirely fictional. But here's the part that keeps it alive. It doesn't introduce a completely new idea. It builds on what was already there. A sense that Antarctica is not fully resolved. That there are areas or conditions that don't fit neatly into the expected picture. And because of that, the diary doesn't feel like an outlier. It feels like an extension. Right or wrong, true or not, it follows the same direction the story was already moving. And once you've read something like that, even if you don't believe it, it leaves an impression. Because now the question isn't just about what was seen, it's about what would happen if something actually did change mid-flight. Chapter 12. A Change in Landscape. Let's stay with that idea for a moment, not as fact, just as possibility. You're flying over Antarctica. Endless ice, no variation, the same visual rhythm for hours, and then something shifts. Not dramatically, at least not at first. The light feels different. The texture below changes just slightly. Maybe there's more contrast, maybe the surface isn't as uniform. At this point, you'd probably question it. Check your instruments, reconfirm your position, because your brain is wired to expect consistency, especially in a place like this. But what if the change continues, gradually? The white giving way to something with more definition, more variation. Not necessarily lush or green or anything extreme, just different. Different enough to stand out. Now, there are grounded explanations for this kind of experience. Light conditions can shift dramatically in polar regions. Reflections can distort perception. Distance can play tricks on the eye. All completely valid. But the human mind doesn't always process those changes as technical effects. It processes them as experience, as something that happened. And once that experience is recorded, it becomes part of the narrative, even if the cause is uncertain. And that's where things become interesting, because now you have a situation where two things can be true at once. There may be a rational explanation, and the experience itself may still feel unusual. And when enough of those experiences exist, they begin to form a layer. Not proof, just presence. A sense that something about the environment doesn't always behave the way you expect it to. And once that idea settles in, you start paying attention to other details. Details that on their own might not stand out, but together start to suggest something else entirely. Chapter 13. The Technology Accounts. Up to this point, the story's been about a place, geography, perception, interpretation. But there's another layer that shows up quietly and then refuses to leave. Movement. Specifically, things moving in ways that don't quite fit. Now, to be clear, this is not part of any confirmed official record. These accounts sit in the same category as everything we've just discussed. Reported, repeated, debated, but never fully established. And yet, they persist. Descriptions of objects or shapes observed briefly during the expedition. Not interacting, not approaching, just present. What makes them stand out isn't their appearance, it's their behavior. Movement that feels different. Sudden changes in direction, acceleration that doesn't follow the expected patterns of aircraft of that time. Moments where something is there and then it isn't, gone as quickly as it appeared. Now, before anything runs away with that idea, there are grounded explanations worth considering. Experimental aircraft development was advancing rapidly during that period. Misidentification is always possible, especially in environments where depth and distance are hard to judge, and perception itself can shift under extreme conditions. All of that matters, but even with those explanations, the descriptions don't fully settle. There's still a gap, a small one, but enough to keep the question open. And that's really what this chapter is, not an answer, a question. Because when you combine everything so far, the scale of the mission, the incomplete mapping, the unusual descriptions of terrain, and now movement that doesn't quite align, you arrive at something new, not a conclusion, a pressure point. And that leads us directly into the first major peak of the story, the moment where everything comes into focus, just long enough to ask what actually happened. Chapter 14, The Return. And then, just like that, it ends. No grand finale, no defining moment. Operation Highjump begins to wind down, and the fleet turns north. Ships that had pushed through ice now retrace their path. Aircraft are secured, equipment packed away. Everything looks orderly, disciplined, almost routine. If you are watching from a distance, you might not even notice anything unusual at all, because nothing dramatic is reported. No single event is highlighted as the reason for leaving. No moment that says this is where everything changed. Instead, it feels quiet, like a decision made somewhere behind closed doors and then carried out without discussion. Now, officially, the mission achieved its purpose. Training completed, equipment tested, data collected. On paper, it works. But when you place that outcome next to everything we've just walked through, the scale, the timeline, the unanswered details, it starts to feel incomplete, like finishing a story without the final chapter. And I'll say this to you plainly. If something truly unexpected had happened, you might expect chaos, panic, urgency. But that's not what this looks like. This looks controlled, deliberate, like a decision to stop rather than an inability to continue. And that distinction matters because one suggests failure, the other suggests choice. And once that thought settles in, the return doesn't feel like an ending. It feels like a withdrawal. And that naturally leads to the next question. Not why they left, but why, after something this large, so little was ever said about it. Chapter 15, The Silence After. After the ship's return, something else happens, or rather, doesn't. The story goes quiet. Reports exist, of course, official summaries, general overviews, enough to confirm what happened on the surface. But when you look for depth, for detail, for the kind of breakdown you might expect from an operation of this scale, there's very little. No extensive public analysis, no widely discussed follow-up, just a closing of the file. And that's unusual, because large operations tend to leave large footprints. They generate discussion, documentation, reflection. This one doesn't. It simply settles. Now, again, there are grounded reasons for that. Post-war priorities were shifting. Attention was moving elsewhere. Not every mission becomes a long-term talking point. That's fair. But here's where the feeling changes. It's not just that there's less information, it's how cleanly the story stops. No loose threads being publicly pulled, no lingering questions being openly addressed. Just a quiet sense of that's it. And when a story ends that cleanly, especially one that didn't feel complete to begin with, people start filling in the gaps. Not because they want to, but because the gaps are there. And once that happens, the silence itself becomes part of the story. Not evidence, not proof, just space. Space where interpretation can exist. And space is where ideas grow. Which is why, over time, the narrative begins to shift. Not through new facts, but through new ways of seeing what was already there. Chapter 16, Two Ways of Seeing. At this point, the story splits. Not into right and wrong, but into perspective. Because there are two ways to look at Antarctica. Both of them make sense, depending on where you stand. The first is familiar. Antarctica as a continent. A vast frozen landmass at the bottom of the world. Remote, harsh, and difficult to access. A place defined by extremes. but ultimately understood within the framework of geography. Science operates there, research continues, everything fits. That's version 1. And it works. But then there's the other. Less formal, less defined. Antarctica as a boundary. Not just a place you go to, but a place that marks a limit, a threshold. Something you approach, but don't fully pass through. Now, this isn't presented as fact, it's an interpretation. One that shows up across different accounts, different discussions, always slightly varied, but always recognizable. And what's interesting isn't which one is correct, it's that both exist at the same time. Because if Antarctica is just a continent, then everything we've discussed falls into place. But if it functions as something more, then those same details start to feel different. The scale of Highjump, the incomplete mapping, the controlled access, the silence afterward. None of it proves anything, but it does change how it feels. And sometimes, feeling is where questions begin. Which brings us to an idea that sits right at the center of this second perspective. An idea that isn't new, but refuses to go away. Chapter 17. The Ice Wall Concept. Some ideas don't arrive all at once. They build slowly, piece by piece. And the concept of an ice wall is one of them. It doesn't come from a single source. It isn't tied to one moment. Instead, it appears across different interpretations, sometimes subtly, sometimes more directly. At its simplest, it's exactly what it sounds like. A continuous expanse of ice. Not just forming a coastline, but acting as a kind of perimeter, a boundary. Something that marks the edge, rather than just the shape of Antarctica. Now, in conventional geography, ice shelves and massive glacial walls absolutely exist. That's real. Towering formations of ice that stretch for miles. So the visual part of the idea isn't unusual. What changes is the meaning attached to it. In some interpretations, these formations aren't just natural features. They're part of something larger, a dividing line, not necessarily artificial, not necessarily intentional, but significant. And here's where it gets interesting. This idea doesn't stand on its own. It connects to everything we've already talked about. The sense of limit, the idea of restricted movement, the feeling that not everything beyond the edge is fully explored. Again, nothing is confirmed. This is not a claim, it's a concept that persists. And the reason it persists is simple. It fits. Not perfectly, not conclusively, but enough. Enough to stay in the conversation. Enough to make people pause just for a moment and look at the map differently. And once you do that, once the edge stops feeling like a line, the question shifts again. Because now, it's not just about what Antarctica is, it's about what might exist on the other side of it. Chapter 18. Beyond the Ice. Once the idea of a boundary settles in, even just as a possibility, the question changes. It's no longer about Antarctica itself, it's about what might exist beyond it. And this is where the story stretches, because across different accounts, different eras, different voices, the same general shape keeps appearing. Not clearly, not consistently, but enough to notice. The simplest version is this: undiscovered land. Not in the sense of hidden continents waiting to be claimed, but regions that exist outside the routes that are regularly explored. Places that sit beyond the familiar paths. Environments that could exist independently, cut off from the conditions we associate with Antarctica. Now, if that sounds unlikely, that's fair. But history has a way of reminding us that unlikely and impossible are not always the same thing, especially when it comes to places that are rarely visited. Then the idea shifts slightly, because some interpretations don't stop at land. They suggest ecosystems, isolated, self-contained, shaped by conditions we don't fully understand. Not dramatic, not necessarily extreme, just different. And then, more quietly, another layer appears. Not always stated directly, sometimes only implied. In some interpretations, these regions are not empty, but inhabited, in ways that are rarely described in detail. Now, nothing here is confirmed. This sits firmly in the realm of theory, but it persists. And it persists for a reason, because once you accept the possibility of space beyond the known routes, the mind naturally begins to ask what fills it. And that question doesn't demand an answer, it just stays there, lingering. And if there is something beyond the ice, the next thought becomes almost inevitable. What if it isn't just beyond it, but beneath it? Chapter 19. Beneath the Surface. So far, the story has moved outward, toward edges, toward distance, but now it turns downward. Because some of the oldest interpretations don't describe hidden places beyond the ice, but beneath it. Not open landscapes, but enclosed systems, subterranean spaces. Now, before we go any further, let's ground this. We already know that Antarctica hides a lot beneath its surface. Lakes sealed under miles of ice. Mountain ranges buried and unseen. That's real. So the idea that something exists below isn't unusual in itself. What changes is the scale. In some interpretations, these aren't just isolated features. They're connected systems, networks, environments shielded from the surface entirely. And this is where a very old idea quietly enters the conversation. Agartha. Not as a confirmed place, not as something mapped or proven, but as a concept that has appeared across different cultures and stories. A hidden world. Not beyond reach, but out of sight. Now, in the context of Antarctica, it takes on a different tone. Because the ice above becomes more than just environment. It becomes separation. A layer between what is seen and what is not. Again, there is no evidence that such a place exists. This is firmly within mythology and interpretation. But like everything else in this story, it connects. The idea of limits, the sense of incomplete mapping, the feeling that not everything is fully accessible. And when you place it all together, the boundary is no longer just horizontal, it becomes vertical, above and below. And at that point, the question is no longer just about geography. It becomes something else entirely. Because whether we're talking about distant land or hidden space beneath the surface, the pattern remains the same. There are places we understand and places we don't. And Antarctica seems to sit right between them. Which brings us not to an answer, but to the present. Chapter 20. The Controlled Edge. If we step away from the story for a moment and look at Antarctica today, it appears structured, defined, governed. The Antarctic Treaty System is in place. An agreement between nations to keep the continent focused on peaceful use and scientific research. No territorial conflicts, no open military presence. On the surface, it's one of the most cooperative international efforts in existence. And in many ways, it works. Research stations operate year-round. Data is shared. The environment is protected. It feels stable, reassuring even. But then we look a little closer. Because access to Antarctica is not free. Travel requires permission. Routes are predefined. Movement is monitored. Exploration in practice is limited. And this is where the tone begins to shift, just slightly. Because while you can go there, you cannot go anywhere. You can see it, but not fully explore it. And that difference is subtle but important. So we arrive at a simple line. Access is possible, but never without structure, oversight, and limitation. Now, there are clear reasons for this. Safety, preservation, logistics, all valid. But when placed alongside everything we've explored, it carries a different feeling. Not hidden, but not entirely open. And as that thought settles in, the idea of a boundary quietly returns. Not as a wall, not as a claim, just a sense that structure exists up to a point, and beyond that, things become less defined. The map, in a way, begins to thin, not disappearing but losing detail. And this is where the story gently lets go of certainty, because whether Antarctica is exactly what we understand it to be, or something slightly more, it still occupies a unique place, a place at the far edge of the world, a place that is not empty but not fully explained. And maybe that's enough, because not every question needs an answer. Some simply remain. And so the edge remains, not fully explained, not fully explored, but still present at the farthest limits of the world we know. And perhaps it is not the end of the map, but the point where understanding begins to fade.